It was a regular Wednesday afternoon. You know, the kind where you think nothing extraordinary is going to happen. I was in the middle of sorting laundry when my husband, Dan, dropped a bombshell. "Honey, you won't believe this," he said with that lopsided grin of his, holding a stack of papers. "I've been selected for a week-long business trip overseas. Can you believe it?" I blinked at him, laundry half folded in my hands. Dan's job often took him away for work, but never for this long. A whole week? The idea of being alone for so long felt strange. We'd always been together. The house was always filled with his presence, his laughter, and now it was about to be just me. "I guess I'll have to get used to some quiet," I joked, but my heart raced a little. Dan, ever the optimist, packed his bags with enthusiasm, kissed me goodbye, and left with a cheerful, "Don't worry, babe, I'll call every night." As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in our house seemed to stretch endlessly. I hadn't realized how accustomed I had become to the noise of his presence. The first couple of days went by smoothly enough. I worked from home, watched some guilty pleasure TV shows, and took leisurely walks around the neighborhood. The usual stuff, you know? Everything was perfectly fine. But by the third day, I couldn't shake this creeping loneliness. It's like when you're too long without anyone to talk to, and suddenly you start talking to yourself. I caught myself narrating aloud to the plants. Yes, I had become that person. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, wrapped in my oversized blanket, the one Dan always teased me for, saying it looked like a carpet, the doorbell rang. Now I wasn't expecting anyone, so naturally, I felt a little surprised. Opening the door, I saw Mark. Mark, as in Dan's best friend and our longtime family friend, standing there with a warm smile and a bottle of wine in his hand. "Hey, I thought I'd check on you," he said casually. "I figured you'd be feeling a little lonely with Dan away." I blinked at him. Lonely? Well, maybe a little, but I wasn't about to admit that out loud. "Oh, you didn't have to do that, Mark. But thanks." "Of course. What are friends for? Plus, I was in the neighborhood and it's been forever since we hung out." And just like that, I found myself letting him in, making small talk while opening a bottle of wine. Mark had been in our lives forever. He and Dan were like brothers since college. But we'd never really spent much one-on-one time together. Usually it was all about Dan. "Wow, look at you, bringing wine. Are you trying to impress me?" I teased, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled. "Nah, just figured you could use a little break from being solo. Consider this a friendly check-in." Before I knew it, we were sitting on the couch, the wine making both of us a little more relaxed than usual. We talked about work, how Dan was adjusting to his business trip, and a few other mutual friends. I hadn't laughed this much in days. Mark had a way of making everything light, easy, and, well, funny. There was something comforting about him, and I realized I hadn't really paid attention to how genuinely nice he was until now. Time slipped by, and soon 2 hours had passed, just like that. But then, something shifted. I can't really put my finger on it, but the way Mark looked at me, it wasn't anything inappropriate, not at all. But it was different. Maybe it was the wine or the cozy evening, but the air between us felt charged with something unspoken. My cheeks burned a little, and I quickly brushed it off, thinking I was reading too much into it. After all, this was Mark, my husband's best friend. Nothing weird here, right? Still, I found myself glancing at the clock. "Wow, it's late," I said, hoping to break whatever tension had crept into the room. "I should probably head to bed." Mark smiled, his usual charm returning. "Of course, thanks for the company. I'll let you get your beauty sleep." I laughed, showing him to the door. As I closed it behind him, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, was it? The next morning, I woke up with that evening still fresh in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying every little moment in my head. Was I overthinking things? Maybe it was just the loneliness playing tricks on me. Or the wine. Yeah, definitely the wine. But the more I tried to shake it off, the more it nagged at me. Why was I thinking about Mark so much? I mean, I've known him for years. Years! He's always been just a friend. And yet, here I was, wondering what that moment had been. I needed to talk to someone. So I called my best friend, Lily. She was my go-to for everything. The one person who would give it to me straight. "So, guess who dropped by last night?" I began, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "So, guess who dropped by last night?" I began, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "Mark, Dan's friend," I added quickly when she paused. "What for?" Lily asked, her voice instantly curious. "Oh, just to check on me. He brought wine, we talked. It was nice." Lily stayed silent, waiting for more. She knew me too well. "Okay, fine," I admitted, my voice lowering. There was this moment, but it wasn't anything really. Just a feeling. Lily mused. "What kind of feeling?" "That's just it. I don't even know. It wasn't anything specific. It just felt, I don't know, like something was there, but it wasn't." Lily's laugh on the other end made me smile. "Girl, it sounds like you're driving yourself crazy." "I know," I groaned. "I think it was just the wine talking, right?" "Probably, but be careful. Those moments have a funny way of creeping up on you when you least expect it." That should have been the end of it. I told myself it was just a random evening and not to think about it anymore. But then, the universe, because it loves messing with you, sent me a message. Literally. My phone buzzed that night during dinner. It was Mark. "Had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome." I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling that same flutter of nerves from the night before. What was this? Why was I feeling like a schoolgirl? It was ridiculous. I typed out a response, then deleted it. Typed out another. Finally, I settled on, "Not at all." It was nice having company. His reply came quickly. "Glad to hear that. Was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow if you're free." My heart did a little somersault. I hesitated. This was my moment to shut things down, to stop this little game we were playing. But instead, I found my fingers typing. "Sure. Tomorrow works." The next day, I spent way more time than usual getting ready. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like I was trying to impress anyone. I was just, trying not to look like I'd been binge-watching TV in my pajamas for 3 days straight. Nothing wrong with that, right? By the time Mark knocked on the door, I had gone through my closet twice and settled on something casual, but cute enough to feel confident. My heart pounded a little as I opened the door. "Hey, again!" Mark greeted me with that easygoing smile of his. He had brought another bottle of wine. Classic move, right? "You're really spoiling me with all this wine," I teased, letting him in. He shrugged playfully. "Just trying to make sure you don't get too bored without Dan around." We settled into the living room, and it felt surprisingly normal. We laughed, shared stories from the past, and sipped wine. But somewhere between the third glass and the fourth, the conversation took a turn again. That kind of turn where you realize you're sharing more than you usually would. "So," Mark said, leaning back and looking at me with those curious eyes. "You ever think about how life would be different if things had gone a different way? Like, if you hadn't met Dan?" I paused, a little surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly, swirling the wine in his glass. "I mean, what if you'd made different choices? Gone down a different path?" I blinked at him, my mind racing. What was he getting at? Was this some kind of hypothetical? Or was there something more here? I laughed nervously, trying to keep things light. "Well, I guess we'd never know, right? Life's full of what-ifs." Mark nodded, but his eyes stayed on me, and suddenly I felt the air in the room get thicker. It wasn't like before. This time it was heavier, more real. "What if," he continued, his voice dropping lower, Things had gone differently between us? I froze. Between us? What was he even talking about? There had never been anything between us. At least nothing like that. I felt my cheeks burn, a wave of awkwardness washing over me. Mark? I started, unsure of how to respond. What are you? But before I could finish, he leaned forward, close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath. His hand reached out, just grazing my arm, and suddenly everything felt too intense. Too close. My heart was racing, and not in the good, fun way. It was the kind of racing where your brain is telling you to get out of a situation before it spirals out of control. I stood up abruptly, forcing a smile. I think we've had enough wine for one night. Mark blinked, his hand dropping. Yeah, you're right. Sorry if I made things weird. I didn't mean to. I waved it off, pretending to laugh, even though inside I felt like a hurricane was swirling in my chest. No worries, we're all good. He left soon after that, and the moment the door clicked shut, I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What had just happened? Did he really just... was that a thing? Or was I imagining it? That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the moment, wondering if I had somehow encouraged it. Had I sent the wrong signals? Or was it all just a misunderstanding? The next morning, I decided to call Lily again. She was the only one who could help me untangle this mess. So, remember when I told you about Mark? I asked, my voice low as if I didn't want the walls to hear. Yeah, Lily replied, her tone instantly alert. What happened? Did he come over again? Yes, I admitted, cringing at the memory of the previous night. And it got weird, really weird. Lily gasped. Weird how? Did he try something? I hesitated before answering. I don't know, he didn't do anything, physically, but it felt like he was testing the waters, you know? He was seeing if I'd be open to something more. Lily's silence spoke volumes. I didn't encourage it, I added quickly, feeling the need to justify myself. But maybe I wasn't clear enough? I don't know, Lily, I'm so confused. Listen, Lily finally said, her voice firm. You need to shut that down. Now before it gets any worse. This could ruin everything. I sighed. I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting Mark, of having that awkward conversation, made my stomach churn. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the quiet house, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mark. Hey, I'm really sorry if I overstepped last night. I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to brush it off, pretend like it never happened, and move on. But the other part of me knew that if I didn't address it head-on, it could happen again. And the last thing I needed was more confusion. So, after what felt like an eternity, I finally typed out a reply. It's okay, but let's just keep things friendly. I don't want any misunderstandings. Mark's response came almost immediately. Of course, I get it, friends it is. I let out a sigh of relief. It was over, or at least I hoped it was. But even as I put the phone down, a nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind. A few days later, Dan finally came back from his trip. When I saw him walk through the door, all of my worries seemed to melt away. His warm smile, his familiar hug, it felt like everything was back to normal. How was the trip? I asked, wrapping my arms around him as he set his suitcase down. Long, he said with a chuckle. I missed you. I missed you too, I replied, meaning it more than I ever had before. For a moment, I considered telling him about what had happened with Mark. Should I be honest? Would it make things worse? After all, nothing had really happened. Right? But as I looked into Dan's eyes, full of trust and love, I decided to keep it to myself. There was no point in stirring the pot over something that was, thankfully, resolved. Life went back to normal after that. Dan was home, the house was full of noise again, and everything felt like it was falling back into place. I didn't hear much from Mark after our last conversation, and honestly, I was okay with that. Maybe things had gotten a little too close for comfort, but in the end, I was grateful that nothing more had happened. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that week. What if things had gone differently? What if I had let the lines blur just a little more? It's funny how life works. How a single moment can shift the course of everything, even if it's just for a brief second. I never told Dan about that week with Mark, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unsaid, tucked away in the back of your mind where they belong.